What had begun as neatly packed stone leaving Braxia had slowly unraveled into an uneven dirt trail, then into a winding stretch of hardened earth cut through low hills and scattered tree lines. The wagon groaned as it rolled over a shallow rut, its reinforced frame holding steady but not without protest. The two horses at the front pulled with steady discipline, their breath visible now in the cooler air, each exhale lingering just a moment longer than it had the day before. Inside the wagon, the space had been arranged with mathematical efficiency. Crates were securely tightened along the sides, weapons lashed down, packs wedged into corners to keep them from shifting with the movement. Vera lay along a padded stretch near the back, still unconscious, her condition unchanged but stable under Juno's careful watch. Benny had planted himself beside her as he had every mile since they left, head resting on his paws, ears flicking occasionally at the sound of the wheels or something unseen in the forest. Thorin's towering frame took up more space than anyone liked to admit, but the automaton remained perfectly still despite the motion, his glowing lenses fixed forward as if the journey itself required his full attention. "I am adjusting to the concept of ground travel," he said evenly. Jackson, half sitting against a crate with one leg stretched out, glanced up at him with a faint smirk. "Oh, is that so?" "Yes," Thorin replied. "Previously, I had wings." "Right, of course," Jackson nodded. Across from him, Leaf shifted slightly, wincing as the movement reminded him that his body still hadn't fully forgiven him for the forge. He rolled his shoulder once, testing it, then leaned his head back against the wooden wall behind him. The wagon hit another bump, sharper this time, and the entire interior shifted with it. Jackson grabbed an edge of a crate to steady himself. "Hey, who's driving?" he called out. "Dion," came an immediate answer from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of enthusiasm rather than reassurance. Jackson groaned, then looked toward the others. "Great." Cassian's voice came from just beyond the wagon, steady and close. "Relax. I'm right here. He's doing fine." Jackson leaned slightly toward the opening at the front, just enough to catch a glimpse of him walking alongside the wagon, one hand resting loosely near the hilt of his weapon as he kept pace with the horses. Dion laughed, loud and unbothered. "Dion is excellent driver." "Dion nearly drove us into a tree 10 minutes ago," Saberic's voice cut in from the other side of the wagon, where he walked opposite Cassian, one hand resting slightly against the side of the cart. "It was a small tree," Dion defended. "It was not a small tree," he replied. Dorian's voice followed from a few steps behind them. "It was, in fact, a very large tree." There was a brief pause. "Dion avoided it," he added. "That is one way to phrase it," Saberic said dryly. Inside the wagon, a faint chuckle passed between Gabriel and Leaf. Jackson leaned back again, folding his arms loosely. "I feel incredibly safe." "You're inside the wagon," Leaf said. "Statistically, you are. That is not as comforting as you think it is." The rhythm of the road settled again for a few moments. The sound of the wheels, the steady pull of the horses, the quiet presence of the others walking alongside them. It all blended into something almost consistent. Gabriel shifted, his hand moving briefly to the bandaging at his ribs. The movement was subtle, but not subtle enough. Juno noticed immediately from the back of the wagon. "How is it?" He didn't answer right away, testing the breath first, the pressure beneath it, the slow, unwelcome presence that hadn't left him since the forge. "It's doing great. It's me that has issues," he said sarcastically, faking a laugh. Juno smiled, but it wasn't genuine. She knew he was in rough shape. The wagon rolled forward, the land ahead beginning to shift again. The low hills were giving way to rougher terrain, the distant line of the Hollow Pass mountains barely visible through the haze ahead, jagged shapes cutting into the sky like something waiting. Jackson followed Cassian's gaze through the opening, squinting slightly. "Those are them, huh?" Dorian stepped closer to the side of the wagon, glancing ahead as well. "Yes." Jackson sighed. "It looks cold there." "Well, yes, that is due to the elevation. Temperatures drop the higher we get," Dorian replied factually. Jackson looked at him blankly. Dion shifted the reins slightly, guiding the horses as the road curved. "Mountains do not scare Dion." "We know, Dion. You're not scared of anything," Gabriel said from inside. Dion grinned. "Dion will show mountains who is stronger." "That's not how mountains work," Leaf muttered. The wagon creaked again as it climbed a shallow incline, the road narrowing slightly as it bent toward the rising terrain ahead. Cassian slowed his pace just enough to rest a hand briefly against the side of the wagon, grounding himself as he looked forward. "We're about halfway." he said. Seberic glanced toward him. You sure? Yeah, or close enough to be sure. Seberic let out a slow breath. Good. Leaf shifted again, closing his eyes for a moment. That means we're officially too far to turn back. Cassian didn't answer. Gabriel spoke up again from inside the wagon. We should talk about this seance thing. The Crimson Sun's plans for the Blood Moon. We only have a few days until it starts. Jackson shifted slightly, glancing toward him. Do we have to talk about it? Yes, Gabriel replied. I think we should discuss it at least. Do we understand it? Are we going to stop it? Dorian replied from outside the wagon. You're right. We should talk about it. Gabriel adjusted his posture slightly, the movement careful now, measured against the pull in his ribs. A ritual like this requires alignment, he said. Not just components or instruments. The blood moon is what makes it possible. Juno frowned, her gaze still forward on the road. Possible how? Gabriel exhaled slowly, choosing the words as he went. It thins the boundary between planes, between life and death, between what is and what shouldn't be. Jackson let out a quiet breath. Lovely. Leaf tilted his head slightly, watching Gabriel more closely now. So without it, they can't complete the ritual, Gabriel finished. Dorian nodded once, already following the logic. Which means everything they've built, the forge, the weapons, the coordination, is all leading to that moment, Cassian said from outside. The wagon creaked again as it rolled over another uneven stretch of ground. The horses slowed slightly on the incline, their pace steady but strained. Jackson leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Okay, so let's say they pull it off, he said. Let's say the blood moon hits, the ritual works. We can't stop it, and Xavier comes back. He looked between them. What does that actually mean? The question lingered longer than anyone liked. Dorian was the first to answer, but his voice had lost some of its usual certainty. It means the return of a being who already broke this world once, he said. Only this time, with 300 years of preparation from his followers. Juno's grip on the edge of the wagon tightened slightly. Preparation also backed by the church. Yes, Dorian said. Leaf let out a quiet, humorless breath. That's the part that still doesn't make sense to me. They know what he is. They have to. There's no way the church doesn't understand what Xavier actually is. The church has been around since, the dawn of time. Centuries before Xavier was alive. They do, Gabriel said. Then why? Leaf asked, sharper now. Why would they back this? Gabriel's expression didn't change. Because I don't think they see it as supporting him, he said. Jackson frowned. What does that mean? It means, Gabriel replied, they believe they will control him, the way a knight wields a sword. That earned a quiet, skeptical look from almost everyone. They're not that stupid, Jackson said. They are that convinced, Gabriel corrected. Dorian nodded slowly. Religious certainty, he said. Once a belief reaches that level, it stops questioning itself. Juno glanced toward him. You're saying they think this is God's divine will? Yes, Dorian said. Xavier isn't just a monster to them. He's a tool. A quiet weight settled over the group. It's clear that they see his return as punishment for the so-called wicked, Gabriel continued. A cleansing force, something sent to purge what they've already decided is corruption. Leaf let out a dry laugh. So they're bringing back the worst thing this world has ever seen, and calling it judgment, Juno finished. Yes, Gabriel said. Jackson leaned back again, shaking his head slowly. That is insane. It is, Dorian agreed. But it's also effective propaganda, Gabriel added. That drew a look from Cassian. The church is great at propaganda. Gabriel nodded and gestured slightly with one hand, though the motion was restrained. The wither, he said. The church is already using it. Juno scowled. Another thing to point to as punishment from God, she said. Yes, Gabriel replied. They've taken something unnatural, something destructive, and convinced people it's a part of a greater purpose, a cleanse of the unfaithful. Leaf's jaw tightened. We are seeing what it does. It has nothing to do with faith. And now, Gabriel continued, they're scaling that idea up. Dorian's eyes narrowed slightly as the realization settled in. They're conditioning the people, he said quietly. Gabriel nodded once. By the time Xavier returns, he said, half of Kjlovania will already believe it was meant to happen. Jackson stared at him. You're telling me people are just going to accept that? Some will. People want to know why things happen. They need to find meaning and purpose in life, Gabriel said. And the rest? Juno asked. Cassian answered that one. They'll be forced to. Silence followed. The wind picked up slightly, brushing past the wagon in a low, steady current that carried the cold with it. Leaf shifted again, his gaze drifted toward the distant mountains. And we're supposed to stop that from happening, he muttered. Cassian didn't look back at him, but replied, Yes. Dorian's voice came quieter now, more focused. Which means finding this journal isn't just optional, he said. If Xavier created the masks and wrote about it, maybe he wrote about the ritual he used. Maybe we can find something that will help us stop it. Jackson let out a slow breath, dragging a hand down his face. No pressure then. Dion's voice cut in from the front, still holding the reins steady. Dion does not understand. Everyone looked up toward the front of the wagon. Dion glanced back over his shoulder, brow furrowed. If the church wants to stop evil, he said, why bring back bigger evil? Dorian spoke up, his tone quieter than before. Because, Dion, like we said, they believe they're the ones in control of it. Dion frowned. They are not. No, they are not, Cassian replied. The conversation lingered in the air, heavy and unresolved, but it didn't die. It just changed direction. All right, Jackson said, cutting through the tension. We've covered the end of the world. That was uplifting. Let's talk about the thing we're currently carrying that might also ruin us. He looked out at Dorian. The mask. Dorian was still walking near the rear wheel, one hand resting lightly against the satchel at his side, the motion almost absent-minded, but not quite. His fingers pressed once against the leather as if he was confirming something was still there, or still contained. Cassian noticed it. Yeah, Cassian said, his tone even. Let's talk about it. Dorian glanced up, meeting his gaze. You've been quiet about it, Dorian, Juno added from the other side of the wagon. That usually means something. Dorian straightened slightly. It's not a passive entity, he said. That got everyone's attention. Leaf shifted, leaning back just enough to see him more clearly. Define not passive. Dorian hesitated, not because he didn't have the answer, but because he was deciding how much of it to say out loud. I can feel it, he said finally. Not physically, not like an enchantment radiating outward. It's internal. Gabriel's eyes narrowed slightly. Like some kind of influence? Yes, exactly, Dorian said. Jackson made a face. That's not comforting at all, buddy. Dorian ignored him, continuing. It's subtle. It doesn't force anything. It doesn't override you. He paused, choosing the words carefully. It just suggests. Silence settled again, sharper this time. Juno's brow furrowed. Suggests what, exactly? Dorian's fingers tightened briefly against the strap of his satchel. Perspective, he said. Priorities. It nudges your thinking in directions that align with it. Leaf let out a quiet breath. Does it make you envious? In a way, yes. I can understand it. Why Azmakel worked the way he did. Calculating, copying. It consumed him, Dorian said. Cassian stepped a little closer, his tone firm. And? Dorian met his gaze without hesitation. And I've resisted it. There was no uncertainty in that answer. Jackson studied him for a second. So far. Dorian didn't flinch. So far, he agreed. Gabriel crossed his arms slightly, watching him more closely now. What does it feel like? Dorian's expression shifted just slightly. It feels like clarity, like it wants to be worn, he said. That answer didn't sit well with anyone. Clarity, Juno repeated. Yes, Dorian said. It makes certain thoughts feel justified. He looked ahead at the road for a moment, then back at them. You see something someone else has, he continued, and instead of dismissing it, instead of moving past it, you start asking why it isn't yours. Leaf gave a dry, humorless smile. That's a dangerous line of thinking. Yes, Dorian said, it is. And you're just ignoring that? Jackson asked. Dorian shook his head once more. No, he said, I'm aware of it. He tapped the side of his temple lightly. There is a difference. Cassian held his gaze for a long second, weighing it. And if that changes? Dorian didn't hesitate. You know what to do if it does. The certainty in his voice was sharp enough to cut off any immediate argument, but it didn't erase the concern. Juno looked away first, her attention shifting back to the road ahead, though her grip on the wagon hadn't loosened. Leaf leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. "Speaking of things that don't stay dead," he said, voice quieter now. "Can we talk about Theric?" Cassian's jaw tightened slightly. "He's dead." "He was decapitated," Jackson added, pretty definitively, I might add. "By Adrian," Dion said from the front, nodding once as if that alone settled it. "It was very convincing." Dorian didn't respond, and Cassian noticed. "What?" Dorian glanced between them, then exhaled slowly. "I don't think he's gone. Well, for good at least," he said. The wagon creaked as it rolled forward, but no one else moved. Juno turned her head sharply. "How do you figure?" Dorian adjusted the satchel slightly at his side, his fingers brushing past the edge of the mask again before he pulled his hand away. "When we were in the Codex, there were references. Fragmented, incomplete, but consistent." Leaf's eyes narrowed. "Consistent to what?" Dorian met his gaze. "To something or someone called the Man with Many Faces." A quiet shift moved through the group. Gabriel spoke first this time, his tone low. "Go on." Dorian nodded slightly. "It wasn't described like a person, so to speak. More like an extension, a construct of will bound to something greater." "Bound to what?" Cassian asked. "To Xavier and the masks," Dorian continued. "There were mentions of a tether. Not physical, not even magical in the traditional sense." He frowned slightly, recalling the phrasing. "Something closer to a shared essence." Juno's voice tightened. "You're saying he's tied to the masks?" "Yes," Dorian said. "Which means," Gabriel added quietly, "as long as the masks exist." "So does he," Dorian finished. Jackson stared at him. "You're telling me we watched that thing get its head ripped off?" "And that might have not been the end of it?" Leaf added. Dorian nodded once. "Yes, we shouldn't assume he's gone, even with what we saw." That was the truth of it. No comfort, no reassurance, just clarity. The wagon rolled steadily over uneven ground, the rhythm of its wheels settling into something almost hypnotic as the road stretched on beneath them. Inside, the quiet from the last conversation hadn't fully lifted. It lingered in the way no one rushed to fill the silence, in the way each of them seemed just a little more aware of what they faced. Cassian walked along the wagon for a few more minutes before he reached out, catching the edge of the frame and pulling himself up just enough to peer inside. Leaf. Leaf didn't look up immediately. He sat with one arm resting loosely across his knee, the other near his satchel, posture relaxed in a way that wasn't quite natural. He glanced up after a second, expression neutral. "Yeah?" Cassian held his gaze. "We should talk." Leaf's mouth twitched slightly, something between a smirk and a warning. That's usually not how good conversations start. Cassian didn't take the bait. "The cosmos." The shift in Leaf's expression was small, but it was there. He leaned back just a fraction, eyes narrowing slightly. "What about it?" Cassian rested his arm along the wagon's edge, his tone calm but firm. "Same thing we just talked to Dorian about with the mask." The corner of Leaf's mouth twitched slightly. "Not the same thing." Cassian tilted his head slightly. "Oh, it's not?" "No," Leaf said flatly. "It's not." A quiet beat passed between them. Cassian didn't look away. "You've been quiet about it." Leaf let out a short breath through his nose. "That's been said already today. It's starting to feel like a theme." "I'm just asking, because we're all being honest here," Cassian replied. "Your behavior with this object is off." Leaf's jaw flexed, just enough to give the wrong impression. "I'm fine," he said. Cassian shook his head once. "I don't think you are. That thing almost took you last time." "It didn't. It tried." Leaf's eyes flicked toward the satchel for half a second, then back to Cassian. "And I handled it." Cassian leaned in slightly, voice dropping. "Did you?" The air inside the wagon shifted. Juno glanced over the far side, catching the edge of the tension but not stepping in. Not yet. Leaf's posture straightened now, the relaxed edge gone. "Yes," he said, more firmly this time. "I did." Cassian studied him for a long moment. Then his gaze dropped to the satchel at Leaf's side. "Then you won't mind if we take a look." Leaf's hand moved before the words had fully settled. It landed on the satchel. Firm. "No." The answer came fast. Cassian's eyes lifted back to his. "That wasn't exactly a request." Leaf leaned forward slightly, tension coiling under the surface. "The answer is still no." Another beat. The wagon creaked as it rolled over a dip in the road. the shift throwing in a subtle sway through the space between them. Cassian didn't break eye contact. "Move your hand, Leaf." Leaf didn't. "No." Cassian reached anyway. It wasn't aggressive, it wasn't sudden, but it was deliberate, and that was enough. Leaf's hand snapped tighter around the satchel, pulling it back just as Cassian's fingers brushed the edge of the strap. "Don't," Leaf said, sharper now. Cassian's grip tightened slightly. "Let it go." The tension snapped. Leaf yanked the satchel back. Cassian didn't release. For a split second, they were both pulling. Then, the strap slipped. The satchel tore free between them, and the contents shifted. Something heavy hit the wood of the wagon floor with a dull, hollow sound. The encapsulated cosmos rolled free. Even covered, it carried presence. The cloth slipped just enough for a faint, distorted light to leak through the fabric, something inside it moving in ways that didn't belong to this world. It rolled and hit Juno's boot with a dull thud, and then back into the center of the wagon floor. It slowed between the two men. Then, they moved at the same time. Cassian's hand shot forward. Leaf lunged from the opposite side. Their fingers closed around the sphere at the same moment, and the world disappeared. Sound vanished first. The creak of the wagon, the breath in their lungs, the weight of motion beneath them, all of it stripped away so cleanly it left no trace behind. What followed wasn't silence so much as the absence of anything that could be heard at all. Then, the void took shape around them. Cassian stood on a surface that reflected the sky like black glass, though it moved like liquid beneath his boots. Faint ripples spreading outward with each subtle shift of his weight before smoothing back into a perfect mirror. There was no edge to it, no horizon, only an endless plain stretching into nothing, reflecting everything above with unnatural clarity. Above, galaxies churned where a sky should have been, vast spirals of distant light folding in on themselves, drifting in slow, deliberate patterns that felt less like natural motion and more like something being arranged. Stars moved and twirled, bending around unseen centers, drawing lines that could almost be followed into a map. Cassian didn't move. He didn't speak. He couldn't. The thought of it came and went like something slipping through his fingers, the instinct present but unreachable, as if the part of him that would have formed the sound simply wasn't there. Across from him, only a few paces away, Leaf stood on that same surface, facing him, smiling. It wasn't a smile of recognition. There was no relief in it, no confusion, no shared understanding of where they were or what had just happened. It was something quieter, more certain, like he was seeing something Cassian couldn't. Cassian shifted slightly. The surface beneath him rippled. Leaf moved. Perfectly in time with him, not reacting, mimicking him. Cassian's chest tightened as something pressed against his thoughts, a suggestion that didn't feel like his own. It didn't speak in words. It didn't need to. It sharpened edges, adjusted perception, turned something familiar into something uncertain. Across from him, Leaf's expression didn't change, but the stillness in his posture wasn't passive. It was poised, ready, watching in a way that felt measured and deliberate. Suspicion settled between them without either of them choosing it. Cassian took a slow step to the side. The black surface rippled again, reflecting the motion in perfect symmetry. Leaf moved with him. The same distance, the same pace. They began to circle. Above them, the galaxies still shifted and swirled. The spiraling patterns tightened, folding inward, drawing light into shapes that hadn't been there a moment before. The vast expanse of stars seemed to lower, compressing into something structured and intentional. Forms began to emerge. At first, they were only silhouettes against the light, massive and distant. Then they sharpened. Thrones. Dozens of them, suspended in the void, towering and immense, each one of them occupied by a figure that did not move. They sat in stillness, watching without gesture or expression, their forms obscured but present nonetheless. The weight of them pressed downward. Cassian felt it without understanding, a quiet pressure that settled behind his eyes, in his chest, in the space where instinct and thought met. He glanced upward for a second, and in that second something shifted. One of the figures became clearer. The shape, the posture, it was familiar. Cassian's focus snapped back to Leaf instantly, his jaw tightening as the image lingered, uninvited, unresolved. Across from him, Leaf had seen something too. Cassian could tell. His smile had changed. It wasn't subtle anymore, it was certain. The circling continued, neither of them breaking the pattern, and neither of them closing the distance. Between them, the surface of the void began to distort, the reflection no longer perfect, the stars beneath their feet stretching and bending as if something deeper moved beneath the thin illusion of stillness. And then, in the darkness, they appeared. 7 masks. They drifted through the space above them, slow and deliberate, each one distinct, each one carved with something that felt older than the void itself. Their hollow faces turning as they passed, tracking the movement below. The pressure in Cassian's chest tightened again, that same subtle pull threading through his thoughts, suggesting meaning where there should have been none. He felt it try to settle and take hold of him, but he resisted, straining his will as the sky continued to expand around him. Across from him, Leaf's posture shifted slightly, his stance adjusting, grounding, resisting something unseen. The certainty in his expression didn't break. It hardened, like it was being reinforced rather than chosen. Then, the void reshaped itself beneath him. The stars dimmed, and a world took form. It wasn't whole, it wasn't stable, it felt like something half-remembered, dragged into existence without care for how it held together. The land stretched outward in broken fragments, jagged silhouettes of cities rising and collapsing into ash and ruin. Structures leaned where they should have stood, walls split open, streets swallowed by darkness that spread like rot through everything it touched. Smoke drifted in slow, choking waves. The sky itself burned with a dull, bleeding red. Cassian didn't move, but he felt the shift in perspective, the subtle pull in his mind that told him this was not simply something he was seeing, it was something he was being shown. Ahead of him, rising from the wreckage, a single throne stood. It sat anchored in the center of everything, carved from something darker than the world around it, its edges sharp and unnatural as if it had been forced into existence. And seated upon it was Leaf. The same quiet smile rested on his face, unchanged from the moment before, but now it carried something heavier and final. The masks hovered behind him in a slow orbit, each one closer than before, aligned, as if drawn into place by his presence. They moved in silence, their hollow faces turning outward, watching the broken land beneath them. And what stretched out beneath them was the people of Kjlovania. Thousands of them knelt, scattered across the ruined ground, heads bowed, bodies still, their forms reduced to something smaller beneath the weight of what stood above them. There was no resistance left in them, no motion, no defiance, only submission. Cassian felt something twist in his chest, not confusion, not disbelief, but something far more dangerous, a sense that the image made sense, that it fit too easily into place. Across from him, though the distance no longer felt real, Leaf stood within his own vision. The void had reshaped itself for him as well. Where Cassian saw ruin beneath a red sky, Leaf stood in the aftermath of a battle. The ground around him was torn apart, littered with broken weapons and fallen bodies, the remnants of a fight that had ended long before he had arrived. And among those bodies were his friends: Juno, Dion, Dorian, Gabriel, Jackson, and Sir Seberic, lying dead in the rubble, recognizable even in stillness. Leaf's gaze moved over them without flinching, drawn upward by something that demanded his attention. A throne stood above them, raised on jagged stone carved with the same unnatural precision, as if it had been placed there by force rather than time. And seated upon it was Cassian, relaxed and unbothered by the death around him. The masks circled behind him, slower now, more deliberate, each one settling into place as if it belonged there. Around the base of the throne, figures stood, shapes that had once resisted, but now, still, aligned, their presence reinforcing the image rather than challenging it. The land bowed, the survivors knelt, and Cassian watched them all with that same quiet certainty. The void held both truths at once, layered but separate, each man seeing a world shaped by the other, each image settling into place with unsettling ease. The space between them tightened, as if something unseen was drawing a line neither of them had yet crossed. Then, the visions shifted again. The distance collapsed. Cassian no longer stood apart from the throne. He stood before it. The ruined land faded at the edges, the kneeling masses dissolving into shadow until only the throne remained, towering above him. Leaf rose from his chair. The movement was slow and deliberate, as if it had always been inevitable. He stepped down from the throne and approached, closing the distance without hesitation. Cassian moved to meet him. There was no sound, only the steady, measured approach of two figures drawn toward a moment neither of them had chosen. They stopped within arm's reach. Leaf's smile remained. The motion came without warning. A dagger appeared in Leaf's hand as if it had always been there, the movement clean, practiced, and final. Cassian didn't see it until it was already too late. The blade drove into his chest with a thump. The force carried through him as Leaf stepped closer. The twist of the dagger controlled, sealing the act with quiet certainty. Leaf smiled down at him as the world lurched and the pain spread outward, sharp and immediate, the vision fracturing at the edges as the throne behind him blurred into nothing. At the same time, in Leaf's eyes, Cassian rose from his slouched position on the throne. He stepped forward without urgency, his expression unchanged, his movement steady and inevitable. Leaf moved to meet him, closing the distance with the same certainty. They stopped within reach. Cassian's hand moved and the dagger struck. It slid between Leaf's ribs with brutal precision, the impact sudden and absolute, followed by the slow, controlled twist that drove the breath from his chest. Cassian leaned in slightly with a wicked grin as the world faded to black. The black surface beneath them fractured like glass, the stars tearing apart as the entire space folded inward on itself, collapsing faster than thought could follow. Reality returned. The wagon slammed back into existence around them, sound crashing in all at once, the creak of wood, the shift of wheels, and the sharp intake of breath as both men collapsed forward. Cassian hit the floor hard, one hand instinctively pressing against his side, his breath uneven as he caught himself against the wood. Leaf fell beside him, bracing with one arm, his chest rising sharply as the world reassembled itself around him. Between them, the sphere rested where it had fallen, now covered by Juno's cloak. Neither of them reached for it. The wagon jolted hard over a rut in the road, the sudden impact snapping the moment in half as both men hit the floor almost at the same time. Cassian caught himself on one hand, the other still pressed instinctively against his side, his breath uneven as the sensation of the blade lingered far longer than it should have. Across from him, Leaf braced against the wooden slats, shoulders tense, eyes already locked onto him with a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "What the hell was that?" Cassian said, his voice low and edged, pushing himself up to a knee without taking his eyes off of him. Leaf let out a short, strained breath, one hand still planted against the floor as he steadied himself. "You tell me," he shot back, the calm from before completely gone. "You're the one who went for it." Cassian's expression hardened immediately. "I went for it?" he snapped, rising fully now despite the lingering tension in his body. "You just put a blade in my chest." Leaf stood just as fast, the space between them tightening in an instant. "Funny," he said, his tone cutting, "because from where I was standing, you did the same thing." "That wasn't real," Cassian replied, but even as he said it, there was no conviction behind it. Leaf took a step forward. "Yeah, well, it felt real enough, right?" The wagon shifted again beneath them, but neither of them adjusted. The rest of the group were already turning toward the noise, the tension in the air rising fast enough that it didn't need explanation. Juno was the first to step in. "What's going on?" she demanded, stepping in from the far side, eyes darting between them as she took in their posture, the distance, and the way neither of them had broken eye contact. Jackson and Gabriel exchanged glances worriedly. "Ask him," Cassian said, not looking away. Leaf let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh, right, because it's my fault." Juno looked between them. "What happened in there? What did you see?" Cassian shifted first, one step forward, not aggressive enough to strike, but far enough to close the gap. "You think that was me?" he said, his voice quieter now but no less sharp. Leaf didn't back up. "I know what I saw." Cassian's jaw tightened. "You saw what that thing wanted you to see." "And you didn't?" Leaf shot back, stepping in to meet him. The space between them collapsed. Juno moved immediately. "Enough!" she snapped, stepping between them with a force that would have stopped most people. Cassian leaned around her, his focus still locked. "You've been acting off since you picked that thing up." Dorian stepped in now as well, his tone cutting through the noise with sudden clarity. "Both of you need to stop." Neither of them listened. Cassian moved again, pushing past Juno's shoulder just enough to get around her, his hand coming up as if to grab Leaf's coat. Leaf reacted instantly, knocking the hand away with more force than necessary, the motion sharp, controlled, but unmistakably hostile. They collided. Cassian drove forward, Leaf braced and turned with it as they slammed into the side of the wagon, the wood groaning under the impact. "Hey, watch it!" Jackson cried out. "This wagon cannot sustain violence," Thorin stated calmly. He reached over and grabbed Cassian by the cloak and yanked him back to the other side of the wagon, and he hit the bench with a loud smack. Don't make Dion come back there, Dion yelled from the front of the wagon. Cassian shrugged Thorn's grip off hard, eyes locked still on Leaf. You need to give us answers. What the hell is that thing, and why did we see what we did? He said, voice tight with something deeper than anger. Leaf wiped at his mouth with the back of his hand, his stance shifting, lower. You saw what it wanted you to see, just like me. Why am I the untrustworthy one? You're the one who stabbed me. Benny lunged in from the side with a low, aggressive growl, planting himself in front of Cassian with his teeth bared, body angled toward Leaf as if the threat had already been decided. Easy, boy, Cassian said, one hand dropping instinctively to steady the dog, but his eyes never left Leaf. You will both cease this behavior, the faint blue glow in his lenses brightening slightly as he tracked both of them at once. Leaf exhaled sharply through his nose and stepped back half a pace, and sneezed. Achoo! God, that damn dog! The sound cut through the tension in a way that nothing else had, sudden and completely at odds with everything happening. Seriously? Jackson mumbled under his breath. Juno took the moment to step in again. That's enough, she said again, this time quieter, but with more weight behind it. She stepped forward, forcing distance between them, one hand planted firmly against Cassian's chest, the other angled toward Leaf. Whatever you saw in there, both of you, it wasn't real. Dorian watched both of them from the back of the wagon carefully, his expression tight. That thing got into your heads, he said. It showed you something designed to turn you on each other. Cassian's gaze flicked to him for a second, then back to Leaf. Yeah, he said finally, but it didn't sound like agreement. The wagon settled into motion again, the tension lingering in the air even as the immediate fight died down. Benny stayed in front of Cassian for another moment before easing, though his eyes didn't leave Leaf. Leaf turned away first, just slightly, running a hand through his hair as he took a breath and tried to steady himself. There was a long, extended moment of silence that hung in the air. Then Cassian exhaled and reached for his cloak, adjusting it where it had twisted during the struggle. He paused near the pocket. There was something in the inner fold of the fabric that hadn't been there before. He frowned, and reaching in, he pulled it free. A thick card made of parchment, worn at the edges. The material felt older than it should have been, the surface textured like something that had been handled countless times. Cassian turned it over. An image stared back at him. A hooded figure, face hidden in shadow, one hand gripping a dagger angled downward, the blade catching a sliver of light as if mid-strike. And beneath it, etched in clean, deliberate script, the Betrayer. He stared at it for a long moment, then slowly lifted his eyes back to Leaf, who was staring out the rear opening of the covered wagon. The journey continued in silence. Not the easy kind of silence that came with rest, or the quiet rhythm of travel, but something heavier, something that lingered between breaths, and settled into every glance. No one spoke unless they had to. Even the usual small complaints about the road, the cold, the cramped space inside the wagon had faded into nothing. The group was uneasy. No one trusted the quiet. Outside, the world began to change. The land flattened. The sparse tree lines thinned into open stretches of hardened earth and stone. The grass grew shorter, brittle under the cold wind that had begun to creep in from the north. The sky lost its warmth, fading from soft daylight into something paler and harsher. The mountains, which were just a distant outline of sharp points, rose into scale all at once. The Hollow Pass mountains pushed up into the sky like jagged teeth, their peaks cutting into the clouds with a severity that made everything behind them feel small. Snow clung to their upper reaches in thick, uneven layers, wind carving sharp lines across the slopes where stone and ice fought for dominance. With every mile they grew larger, heavier, more oppressive, until it felt less like the party was traveling toward them and more like they were being pulled in. Jackson, who had been walking ahead for the last stretch, slowed slightly and glanced back toward the wagon, then up again at the peaks. Well, he muttered, just loud enough to carry, they definitely look cold from up close. No one answered him. The road narrowed as it wound closer to the base of the mountains, the terrain becoming rougher, less traveled. Wagon tracks became scarce, replaced by uneven ruts and patches of exposed stone that forced the horses to slow their pace. Hours passed. The air had shifted again, colder now, thinner. As they rounded a bend at what felt like the very base of the range itself, a small town came into view. It sat tucked into a sparse outcropping of pine trees like something trying not to be noticed. Only a scattering of structures more functional than intentional, built from rough timber and stone pulled directly from the surrounding land. No walls, no defenses, just a place people stopped because there was nowhere else to go. A few tents had been set up along the outskirts, their canvas worn and patched, smoke rising in thin, reluctant trails from small fire pits. Travelers or simply survivors by the look of them. At the center of it all stood a single building that passed for an actual establishment. Light spilled faintly from its windows, dull and amber against the growing gray of the evening. The wagon slowed as they approached. Cassian stepped forward slightly, resting a hand against the lead horse as he scanned the area, his eyes moving across the few figures present, the layout, the exits out of habit and instinct. Behind him, the wagon creaked to a stop. Juno shifted inside, pushing the flap aside just enough to look out, her expression blank as she took in the place. "This is it?" she asked quietly. Dorian leaned slightly to see past her, his gaze lingering on the distant slope just beyond the settlement. "This is the last stop before the climb," he said. Leaf moved, leaning forward just enough to glance out as well. His eyes moved across the bar, the travelers, the fires, then briefly to Cassian. Cassian didn't look back. The wind cut through the space between them, colder now, carrying with it the faint scent of snow and something older beneath it. "Let's find a place to make camp," Cassian called out, and Dion snapped the reins lightly, urging the horses forward. The wagon rolled past the handful of tents and the low tavern, wheels grinding over frozen dirt and scattered stone, and a short distance further, where a thin cluster of dead trees broke the wind just enough to matter, Dion raised a hand and slowed the horses. The wagon turned off the path and settled into the clearing with a final creak of wood and leather, the horses huffing softly as they came to a stop. The cold had teeth here. It bit through layers, crept into joints, and stiffened fingers. Everyone moved quickly to set up camp for the evening. Juno and Gabriel handled Vera first, carefully shifting her weight and laying her out near the fire pit they cleared from the frozen ground. Benny hovered close, pacing in a tight circle before finally settling in beside her again. Dorian and Thorin worked in tandem, unloading the heavier supplies and setting them in a rough perimeter, using crates and gear to block what little wind the trees didn't catch. The infernal harp was handled with deliberate care, wrapped and secured inside the wagon, with the rest of their more valuable inventory. Dion dragged a fallen branch into place with a grunt and dropped it beside the fire pit, already kneeling to start building something that resembled a proper flame. "Dion will make big fire," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "Make it fast," Jackson replied, rubbing his hands together. "My fingers are starting to go numb." By the time the fire finally caught, the camp had taken shape. Not comfortable or permanent, but enough to rest. Cassian stood near the edge of the clearing, looking back at the settlement, the glow of the tavern visible through the fading light. "We're not staying out here all night without checking that place," he said. Juno straightened slightly from where she had been adjusting Vera's blankets. "Agreed." Dorian gave a small nod. "Information and directions, maybe. And heat," Jackson added immediately. "Let's not forget heat." Seberic was already moving towards the tavern warily. "Let's go, I'm tired," he grunted. They left Thorin and Benny behind with Vera, the automaton standing watch like a silent sentinel as the rest of the group made their way back toward the settlement, boots crunching over the frozen ground as the wind picked up slightly across the open stretch. The tavern looked worse up close. The door hung slightly off its hinges, the wood warped and split from years of neglect and cold. Light spilled unevenly from the inside, flickering more than it held steady, and the faint smell of something burnt, stale, and vaguely sour met them before they even stepped through the threshold. Cassian pushed the door open. It groaned. Inside, the air was warmer, but still stale. A low ceiling pressed the space down, beams darkened with soot and age. A single iron stove glowed faintly in the corner, doing most of the work, though it struggled against the draft that slipped through the cracks in the walls. The room was dim, lit by a handful of lanterns that cast more shadow than light. At the far end of the room stood the source of both the smell and the warmth. A large man, broad in a way that suggested strength once, now softened by years of poor food and worse drink. His clothes were stained, his beard was thick and uneven, and his hands moved with the slow, practiced motion of someone who had done the same task for too long. He tilted a keg and let a stream of thin, murky ale spill into a dented mug, not bothering to look at who it was for. "Evening. Have a drink," he grunted, shoving it across a rough wooden counter. A second pot sat beside him, steam rising weakly from within. He dipped a ladle in and dropped a scoop of something pale and soft into a wooden bowl. "Potatoes," he added, as if that explained everything. A handful of travelers sat scattered across the tables, shoulders hunched, cloaks pulled tight, each one focused on their own survival rather than conversation. No one laughed, no one talked louder than necessary. They ate, they drank, and they waited out the cold. Dorian laid down a handful of coins, and the group grabbed several mugs from the wooden counter. Jackson stepped up behind Cassian, pausing before continuing to an empty table. Well, he murmured, 5 stars. Maybe not, Cassian replied quietly, but it's warm. They quickly took a seat at a crooked table and looked around the room. In the far corner, where the light barely reached, a figure shifted. An old man with wiry silver hair sat at a table alone, with a single lantern that lit up his face as the flame danced inside. Age sat on him heavily, carved into his face in deep lines that came from weather, hardship, and things that left marks deeper than either. One of his eyes was gone, replaced with a cloudy glass orb that caught the lantern light in an unsettling way. One of his arms was also missing, gone from just above the elbow, the sleeve pinned and worn. He watched them for a moment. Then, slowly, he raised his remaining hand and waved. Not threatening, just acknowledging, like he'd been expecting them. He didn't rush over, didn't interrupt. He finished whatever passed for his drink first, setting down the mug with a soft, deliberate tap against the table. Then he stood. The chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back with his legs, his boots dragging slightly as he crossed the room toward them. His one good eye stayed fixed on the group, studying them in a way that felt less like curiosity and more like measurement. When he reached their table, he didn't ask permission. He pulled out the empty chair at the end and lowered himself into it with a quiet grunt, setting his forearm on the table as he leaned in slightly. Up close, the details were worse. The skin around his missing arm was scarred thick, old damage that had healed wrong and never quite stopped hurting. The glass eye didn't sit perfectly either, catching the firelight in a way that made it feel like it was always just slightly out of place. He looked at each of them, one by one. Then he nodded once.
Yep, not from here.
It wasn't a question. Cassian shook his head. No. The man exhaled slowly, like that confirmed something he already knew.
Figured as much.
His gaze drifted briefly toward the door, toward the mountains beyond it, though they couldn't be seen from here.
You're headed up.
Again, not a question. Dorian answered this time. We are. The man leaned slightly back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. His fingers tapped once against the table, slow and uneven.
I've been in these mountains my whole life,
he said.
Before this place was even worth stopping at. They don't care who you are, don't care what you're carrying, don't care how good you think you are.
Jackson shifted slightly. We've handled worse. The old man's eyes moved to him.
Yeah,
he said.
Everyone says that.
A small pause settled over the table. Dorian looked more annoyed than intrigued. Who are you exactly, sir?
Apologies. Name's Brannick. Or Old Brannick, if you like.
The man whistled. More like crazy old Brannick, you mean? A voice from the corner called out, followed by several cackles from the table. The party looked at each other, then back at Brannick.
Don't mind them,
the man continued.
Just 'cause I've been around for a long time, they think I've lost my mind. When the truth is, I just see what they can't.
And what is that you can see exactly? Monsters? The future? I can assume that you can't see much with only one eye, Dorian stated, getting more frustrated at their lack of progress.
Yep, that's about it.
Brannick replied. Dorian rolled his eyes and stood up from the table. Brannick leaned forward, lowering his voice just slightly.
Since you're headed up, you should know. Main pass is gone.
Cassian's expression tightened. Gone how?
Avalanche,
Brannick replied simply.
2 days ago. Whole side of the ridge came down, buried it clean. Rock, ice, snow, all of it.
He made a vague motion with his hand, like it didn't matter how much exactly.
Nothing's getting through that way. Not you, not your horses, not anything.
Juno frowned slightly. There's no way around it? Brannick let out a quiet breath through his nose.
There's always a way,
he said. He shifted in his seat, leaning back again as his gaze moved between them, measuring whether they were the kind of people who would listen.
You can always go under,
he added. Cassian's eyes narrowed slightly. Under? Brannick nodded once.
The mine's a misery,
he said.
Old tunnels run deep through the mountain, deeper than they ever were meant to.
Juno spoke this time, her voice steady. You've been through them? Brannick's mouth twitched slightly.
Oh yeah,
he said.
Many times. Don't recommend it.
Jackson let out a small breath. And why not? He looked down at the table, at the grooves carved into the wood from years of use, from knives and cups and restless hands. His fingers traced one of the lines absent-mindedly before he finally spoke again.
Because Most folk who go in the mines do not come out,
he said.
Tunnels shift, collapse. Prices that were there yesterday aren't there tomorrow, and some of the things down there
He paused slightly.
aren't from the mountain.
Brannick looked up again, his one good eye settling on Cassian.
You'll hear things,
He said.
you'll see things, and if you follow the wrong one,
He gave a small, almost absent shrug.
well, that's about it.
He pushed himself up from the chair with a slow effort, the wood scraping again as he stood. Jackson let out a long sigh. So, you're saying we shouldn't go through the mountain because we will most likely be violently murdered, but that we have no other choice if we want to get to the other side and up to the top. Brannick glanced between them one last time.
Yep,
He said with a grin.
that's about it.